Hello Fleet, and welcome to this ship review of the premium Tier 8 Japanese heavy cruiser, the Atago. Now, many people have been asking for this review, so I finally found some time to actually do it. The Otago comes in at a pretty hefty 10,700 doubloons, so it begs the question, is she really worth it? So hopefully what I'm going to be doing in this episode is I'm going to go break down the stats, talk about any peculiarities that I found about the ship, go over the recommended modules, go over the recommended skills, and then finally show you some gameplay. And hopefully by the end of all that, you will be able to make an informed decision with regards to purchasing or not purchasing this particular ship. So without much further hesitation, let's get going. The Otago comes with a pretty respectable amount of HP, 40,100 hit points, which is actually better than the Mogami and Ibuki, the normal Japanese Tier 8 and Tier 9 heavy cruisers. However, the Otago's 40,100 HP is a little bit deceptive when it comes to her survivability. You see, the Otago has its weakness. It has a rather large Citadel hitbox. From pretty much this entire section here, from the superstructure area at the waterline all the way to the rear funnel at the waterline, is one massive Citadel area, which means that the Otago can be citadeled quite easily and can take massive amounts of damage. And so if you remember seeing, let's say, the last two episodes of Nautical Tales, you would have seen Otagos getting one-shot by battleships. And that is perfectly possible in this particular cruiser. So while her HP is quite substantial, the Otago's overall durability is a little bit more suspect. It is very important when you're playing the ship to try to keep her safe by either angling and keeping your Citadel area away from battleships. The Otago carries a scout fighter, just like most other cruisers these days, but it's not very important, just goes up there, circles around, and shoots enemy bombers and disrupts their attack. Onto something that's a little bit more important, I guess, for deciding whether or not the ship is any good. Let's take a look at the main armament that appears on the Otago. Now, the Otago has 5 dual 203mm guns, and they fire out to a pretty darn good 15.8 kilometers. This is actually better than the Mogami equipping the same guns. The Otago's main guns, however, do fire a tiny little bit slower, achieving only 3.8 rounds a minute, or about approximately a reload every 16 seconds or so. The Otago's main guns do have the same somewhat awkward layout that the Miyoko has at Tier 7, but luckily for the Otago, the turret traverse speed of the guns is actually quite good, which means that unlike the Miyoko, which really suffers from not only the slow turret traverse but also the awkward placement, the Otago has a pretty darn fast turret traverse speed of only 29 seconds. That makes it probably the fastest turret traverse speed of almost any of the Japanese cruisers. So that actually mitigates the awkward placement of the Otago's guns. The maximum dispersion to 15.8 kilometers is 142 meters, which is actually quite good. And you'll find that the Otago generally has some pretty nice salvos, and they're not too far apart. In terms of HE damage and AP damage, the 203mm for the Otago is quite standard compared to all the other cruisers that have 203mm guns. In terms of its fire chance, the Otago's fire chance at 16% is quite respectable, and typically when you fire HE at battleships, you'll find that you do set quite a few fires. Now, the torpedo armament of the Otago is where things get a little bit interesting. The Otago has 4 quad 610mm torpedoes, but they're positioned right in the center of the ship. And not only that, but the Otago has beautiful torpedo arcs. Unlike other Japanese cruisers where you've got to turn the entire ship around in order to bring the torpedoes to bear, the Otago's forward torpedo launcher, the one that I'm focusing on right here, can actually fire the torpedo somewhat forwards of the ship. It's not fully forward, but it's definitely enough for you to only have to turn your ship a little bit in order to get at least one torpedo salvo off. The torpedoes themselves are quite nice. They do 17,233 damage max, and they go 62 knots to a range of 10 kilometers, which means the Otago's torpedoes are definitely quite handy, especially with their improved arcs, and their damage isn't so bad. In terms of AA though, the Atago is, well, quite lacking. The damage of the guns are not great, as she does have a lot of these sort of single 25mm mounts and a couple of these 127mm guns. But overall, typically what I find in battles, I might shoot down 1 or 2 planes here and there, but nothing substantial. Where the Atago, I guess, shines is, in terms of its speed. The Atago is pretty darn fast, going 35.6 knots, which means it can get to places in a hurry, and that also allows it to bring its guns and torpedoes to bear. However, the Atago's speed is coupled with a rather pitiful turning circle radius. 790 meters is rather large, pretty much larger than any of the other comparable Tier 8 cruisers. And also the rudder shift time is not very impressive at all at 13.3 seconds. So while the Atago is nice and zippy, don't expect it to turn that quickly. And finally, the concealment rating of the Atago is actually quite good, 11.9 kilometers on the surface with an air detectability range of 8.7 kilometers. This means that the Atago is relatively stealthy and can actually get into a decent kind of range before opening fire and being detected. So I think the Atago overall there, that does pretty well. Now, in terms of consumables, I do recommend on Otago, because it is a premium ship and you do gain premium ships worth of credits, to opt for these premium consumables. Of course, do remember to change it from the 15 doubloons to the credits, because again, who wants to be spending doubloons to get consumables? In the second consumable slot, do make sure you get defensive AA fire. Even though the Atago's AA is actually quite weak, the defensive AA fire at least has the ability for you to disrupt enemy carrier attacks. And finally, in the last slot, you can get a catapult fighter. Here you can either opt for the premium version or the non-premium version, but once I said, as I said before, it's a premium ship, it gains premium credits, so might as well. In terms of modules, get the main battery modification 1, get gun fire control system modification 1, just for that extra little bit of accuracy. And as for the other slots, this is where things get a little bit interesting. The Atago, on the first miscellaneous slot, should either opt to get damage control system modification 1 to prevent fire and flooding, or get steering gears modification 1. That's because the Atago steering seems to get knocked out frequently. When I play the ship, there's so many times where my rudder gets knocked out on this particular ship. So that's why I also said get the premium damage control party consumable as well. In the fourth slot, definitely get the steering gears modification 2, because that allows you to drop your rudder shift time from 13.3 seconds down to a pretty nice 10.64, which is pretty much standard, comparable, I guess, to other cruisers at the tier. And finally, in the final slot, get Concealment System Modification 1, just because you want to get that little bit extra bit of stealthiness so you can sneak up on stuff and surprise them with guns and torpedoes. Finally, taking a look at the commander, for the first row, you can either get the basic firing training, which helps a little bit with the AA, but again, not so much, or you can actually offer situational awareness, just to give you an indication if there are destroyers nearby. In the second row, I would definitely recommend getting Expert Marksman, just to help your guns turn that little bit faster, because why not? Or if you really feel like it, you can also opt to get the torpedo skill there. In the third row, definitely recommend getting High Alert. The reason why I recommend getting High Alert is, like I mentioned before, the Atago seems to have a very, very vulnerable rudder. It just gets knocked out all the time. So High Alert can help just to keep yourself repaired and going. In the fourth row, you can get Demolition Expert, and I would say get Demolition Expert over Advanced Firing Training, because the 3% on top of the fire chance of 16% gives you a pretty respectable chance of setting stuff on fire. You can also get Advanced Firing Training, but it's not as useful. Finally, on the fifth row, a lot of skills here can be useful. I would say anything from Concealment Expert could be useful, just to give yourself even greater stealth rating. I mean, that would be pretty cool, being pretty much an invisible ship. Last Chance could be useful, especially if you are, your HP has been ticked away and you're fighting with very little HP left. That extra little bit of fire can help. Jack of all trades can be useful. Even preventative maintenance can be useful, just to not get your rudder knocked out so frequently. So that pretty much sums up all the things you could do on the Atago in terms of modules and captain skills. So now let's take a look at some actual battles, and maybe after that, you get a sense if she is actually worth purchasing or not. This first battle comes in from Deprived Pickle, who is captaining an Atago, and Pickle is going to showcase one of the main strengths of the Atago, and that being cruiser-on-cruiser combat. And the reason why the Atago is good on cruiser combat is one, it's got those very nice 203mm guns, which means it can't reliably penetrate cruiser armor, and second, the dispersion and range of the guns are quite good. So that means you're able to really shoot out quite a good distance and have your shells relatively tight still. So that Aoba, which Pickle fired at the very beginning, had 30,000 HP, and after one salvo took 4 Citadel hits and a couple of other shell hits and immediately dropped down to 7,000 HP, pretty much taking that Aoba out of the fight. Right there, even though you might not have fully caught it, Pickle was able to fire off a torpedo salvo without having to turn his ship, and that's one of the other great things about the Atago. Other Japanese cruisers really have to turn their entire ship, expose their vulnerable citadel areas before they're able to get off a torpedo salvo. The Atago, because it has those forward firing arcs, is able to get off torpedoes without having to turn the ship and completely expose that citadel area. This is a huge advantage because it allows the Atago to keep their very vulnerable and very large citadel area relatively safe when compared to other Japanese cruisers, which really do have to take a certain degree of risk in order to deploy their torpedoes. There is one thing about the Atago that you have to really keep in mind, is that the Atago really benefits from people who aim well because of the tightness of the spreads, as well as just the nature of cruiser guns. You really have to hit accurately in order to do damage, and so watching the sequence by Pickle, you can tell that his aim is usually pretty bang on, and he's able to accomplish quite a large number of citadel hits, which allows him to very quickly take down cruisers. And cruisers, which for so many players out there, they think, oh, it doesn't seem that easy to kill. If you're hitting citadels reliably, cruiser HP melts in no time at all. There you go, that Pensacola. There you go, the 3 citadel hits, 15,000 off. That's just painful amounts of damage when you're in a cruiser. And Pickle's going to pretty much pick apart these cruisers in a matter of salvos. It's not like you're really engaged in a slugging match with a cruiser. It's a matter of 2 to 3 salvos and a cruiser gets taken down. So that's one of the strengths of the Atago. It really is good for cruiser on cruiser combat. One other thing I want you to keep an eye out for is the way that Pickle is sailing his ship. He's exposing his broadside a little bit to fire off all his guns. The moment he's finished firing off his guns, he returns back to a rather angled state to protect his citadel area. Something that this Pensacola on the other team that he's shooting at is not doing at all, and neither is this Atlanta. They're both keeping their citadels exposed by having their ships sort of broadside on with Pickle's Atago. And by doing this, these cruisers made themselves very easy targets, because all Pickle has to do is come out when he's ready with his guns, fire off the salvo, and then turn the ship again to maintain that angle. See it? Does that every single time. And there you go, that Atlanta just got melted. 3 citadel hits, 3 hits, like 16,000 damage, instantaneously gets melted. The final enemy ship, that being Miyoko, commits many of the same mistakes that the previous cruisers on his team did, which is showing Pickle that nice flat broadside, giving Pickle the ideal opportunity to lob as much AP into that citadel area as possible. And as you can tell there, you've heard those shells ricocheting. So as long as Pickle maintains this nice little angle to this Miyoko, the Atago is relatively well protected against cruiser fire, and it's not very easy for that Miyoko to kill him. So that Miyoko over there has to resort to using torpedoes, and as you can see, very interestingly enough, this is the problem with many Japanese cruisers. In order to get those torpedoes off, they've really got to expose that broadside, which just makes it so much easier for for you to shoot at, especially shooting AP into that citadel, because they have to expose themselves. Pickle's obviously aware that watching the movement of the Miyoko that torpedoes were probably launched, so Pickle immediately turned the other direction, not continue on the same path. And it also helps that Pickle has the tendency of wiggling around a lot when he's sailing an Atago. This just makes firing torpedoes at a wiggling target quite difficult, because your actual lead indicator is kind of going all over the place. That Miyoko, which missed the first torpedo salvo, turned around, tried it again, almost managed to kill Pickle, but having exposed his big open flat surface, does get killed. So Pickle, even though he was outnumbered in this fight, gets a very respectable 3 kills. But the one thing I really like about the Atago, and more so than a lot of USN cruisers, is because I find that the Atago fits better with sort of the multi-purpose cruiser. It's able to engage more things relatively comfortably. I'm not going to say perfectly, because of course battleships are still a cruiser's enemy, but at least you've got a chance. With a USN cruiser, aside from HE and fire, not much more you can do. With the Japanese cruisers, especially like the Atago, you've got the ability to opt to go and use your torps, which means that when you're faced off against a large battleship, there's always that other weapon system that you can use to wipe out a chunk of the HP before resorting back to your guns. Not only that, but as you can see here, I'm engaging this New Mexico with my HE, and then I see that there's a Cleveland. I've got torpedoes on the way, and you see that I switch from HE to AP. I'm going to turn around, and I'm going to go engage that Cleveland while I'm waiting for my torpedoes to go and hit home. Chances of me wiping out another 14,000 HP from a New Mexico, it's going to take me a little bit longer. So decide to let my torpedoes do most of the work while I try to focus in on this Cleveland a little bit. So firing, but this Cleveland does realize the threat, which actually is a good thing because he's managed to basically turn away and keep his armor relatively angled to my shots and keeping himself relatively safe. So what I can do here is I'm going to switch over in a second because the battleship isn't dead yet. I'm going to fire off my last AP salvo at this Cleveland, turn my ship around, and get my guns to switch over to HE so I can go and finish off that New Mexico. And once I finish off that New Mexico, what I'll do after this is I will just switch back to AP, turn around, and re-engage that Cleveland again. So there we go. Just turn my guns around. And never mind the fact that if you watched the earlier HE salvo, I was able to get pretty consistent fire. Not only that, but the damage done with the HE ammunition to battleships is actually quite respectable. And once again, once I'm done there, immediately transition back to armor piercing and go back to beating down this Cleveland. This Cleveland is going to actually hit the border, so yeah, initially I thought, oh, this is a pretty good chance to try to get a nice hit in there, but yeah, that didn't fully work. He is sliding towards me, but the Cleveland does turn. And once again, you'll see that in both situations against the battleship and this potential cruiser, you'll see just how nice the arc for the torpedoes are. And I'm just going to fire that torpedo ahead of the lead indicator because I know that the Cleveland is turning out. And as he turns away and shows me that nice fat broadside, I finish him off with another AP salvo. And so this shows the Atago's flexibility as a very, very multi-role kind of cruiser. And that brings us to the end of this ship review. So what's the verdict? Well, I think the Atago is a worthwhile buy. In terms of premium ships, she is flexible and can really accomplish many, many different things. The one thing you have to keep in mind is that she does have her vulnerabilities, her large citadel, and in my opinion, a rather weak rudder as well. So if you can tolerate these weaknesses, which if you play conservatively and you keep your ship angled and stuff, can be mitigated, the Atago is certainly a very, very nice ship and one that will serve you well. It is my recommendation that if you're out there in the market looking for a premium cruiser to purchase, this one is quite a good buy. Now, aside from all that, if you want to see more ship review videos, please like and subscribe. Don't forget to have yourself a fantastic weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all on the high seas in your Atagos.